Hello, this is Chris Jantzen. Welcome to the End Evil podcast.
I got the knowledge, wisdom, understanding. Now your word, learned your lesson. I got the knowledge, wisdom, understanding. Now your word, learned your lesson. I got the knowledge, wisdom, understanding. Now your word, learned your lesson.
Erasing the mark of the beast technology, but implanting the seed of spiritual immortality and producing.
With man, let's breathe. The plan must be the rottenness. I plant my seed like a botanist. I show you where the problem is. Beneath the surface.
Hello, friends. This is Chris. Welcome to another wonderful episode of the One Great Work Warriors. Today, I have with me Jerry, Jim, Derek, Brandon, and Crypt Rick. And we're going to talk about a very tricky and interesting topic. We're looking at the topic of suffering. And we were really talking about some deep issues in terms of how do we know that natural law is real? How do we know that objective morality is a principle that we have to deal with in reality when so many people kind of don't like those terms or deny those things might be the case? And that got us on the subject of suffering. And we got to wondering if that might be a way to discuss this difficult topic. And so before we get into it too deep, I'm going to just read to you something I found about the word suffer. The word suffer, I was looking up the etymology, and I like to use the online etymology dictionary. And I found that the word suffer, a verb, it can mean to bear, undergo, or endure. And that's Latin, suffere. And it also can mean sub, as in under. And sub came from ferry, which means to carry, to bear. Also bear children. So it's an interesting and difficult thing to talk about suffering because it's something we all experience. And it's something that affects our lives, and all of our actions don't just affect us, but they affect other people too. So we're also talking about the fact that suffering can be manufactured, and that we don't necessarily have to experience the level of suffering that we are right now. And we're all looking at a world where there's a lot of people experiencing a whole hell of a lot of suffering, and we're asking, is there a better way? And that's really why we've all come together, is because we do have hope for the future. And if there is any hope from the future, it's going to be from our point of view, from my point of view, in people starting to recognize the deeper issues and start to see the principles behind the world we're in, and recognizing that suffering is one of our ways of understanding the balance of natural law. And on that note, I'm going to hand it to my man, Brandon Spencer, who's going to take us into mythological deep dive and understanding of the word suffering and manufactured suffering. Thanks, Brandon.
And thank you for that. And before I, jump into what I want to say, you brought up a good point. Is suffering was required, unfortunately, for all of us to come into this physical realm. So I would say that it's like as a form of how natural suffering. Birth is a suffering thing. To have to go through. Not only for the woman, but for the the child who's birthed into this world. So I consider it like a natural form of suffering. Like there are just you know things that are going to happen, how accidents, how acts of nature, which some people may say that depending on our consciousness, we can maybe help alleviate. But in the physical world, there's always going to be unfortunate things. There's no 100% guarantee of a safe space in the physical realm. It just doesn't exist. So you're always going to have this form of suffering. There's going to be loss of life. We're all are going to mourn. So those are forms of natural suffering. But I like to distinguish between the manufactured suffering, that we are causing due to our ignorance, due to our trauma, fear, not taking personal responsibility. So I think it's good to start and lay a quick foundation. We're talking about, of course, the manufactured suffering, not like the natural suffering that just comes with a part of being, you know, held alive. Because believe it or not, there is responsibility for being, and as long as we are here, then there's responsibility. So when it comes to understanding this suffering from a manufactured chaotic form, I always like to use the allegory, the symbolic allegory of Mayat and Ishvet. And I've done a presentation explaining these concepts because the Egyptians quite understood this. And not only them, but a lot of other great ancient civilizations. And this aspect of Mayat, she was the caring, she was the loving, nurturing way of learning. She represented truth, she represented morality, she represented natural law, she represented harmony, she represented knowledge, she represented balance with nature and her laws. And the Egyptians knew that if they chose her, because she was symbolic of right action, of higher states of consciousness, then they would be pretty much gifted. Mayat would come in the form of rescuing her or rescuing the Egyptians and nurture them with her wings. How Mayat was always said to, have had the wings, almost kind of to wrap hell around you, in and of a sense, because her natural law is supposed to be there to guide us. She was that guiding force. And the Egyptians knew if they took this knowledge and they decided to, go with her teachings and they would harmonize with her teachings, then they would get, let's just say, bountiful way of life. It wouldn't be too much suffering. It wouldn't be too many forms of violence. It wouldn't be, all of these negative forms in degradation of consciousness. Well, unfortunately, we all know here, that when you're dealing with the feminine, how aspect, there's two sides to it. You have the balanced side and then you have this chaotic form. Well, Mayat had a twin, which it wasn't really her twin. She was just one in the same being. She had another form, which was Ishvet, Isfet, Ishvet. And Ishvet was the one that represented chaos. She was the one who represented ignorance. She was the one who represented government. She represented slavery. And again, this was symbolically her represented wrong action. So when the people decided to use coercion, when the people decided to believe in man-made authority and not put truth as the authority and natural law as the authority, when the people decided to steal, stealing from thy neighbor, using violence, using coercion, then Mayat would transform and she would show your ass, because Ishvet was the disciplinary force. So you had these two concepts, which were nothing more but the same concept of natural law. But the whole point of that story, which that story is in a lot of, how ancient civilizations, that story was to use creation, to try to get one to understand and see the bigger picture. Like, hey, there are consequences here. And if you were choosing with your hands to create wrong action and to create coercion, to spread fear, to steal, and to do violent things, you would get Ishvet, you would get chaos. And the Egyptians also knew that if you chose Helmayat, you would get the nurturing aspect. It was considered, how the two ways of teaching, because when you apply these same concepts, it's learning the easy way or learning the hard way. So in actuality, when we're talking about suffering, it really comes down to, are we really truly learning, or which way are we choosing to learn? Are we choosing to learn from the symbolic, allegorical, nurturing aspect of Mayat in her caring aspect, or are we choosing to go down the more chaotic path because we have a hard-headed, diamond-like, calcified ego, and we think that we can control other people? Well, that's going to manifest Ishvet. And not that not that these two beings are like real beings that should be worshipped. No, these were allegorical symbols to get people to understand nature and her laws, you know. And Mayat and Ishvet were also personified in the Greek tradition, Harmonia and Eris. And also too, Dike and Adikia. Dike was like smaller, her rendition of the feminine principle, and Adikia was her counterpart. You had Harmonia and Discordia. I'm sorry, Concordia and Discordia. Concord, was it was the harmony. Discordia was the chaos. And again, it came down to free will choice. And then you had, in the form of the Titans, you had Themis, which is funny because if you're familiar with the mythological story of Zeus and the Titans, Themis was she was one of the Titans who did not get imprisoned in Tartarus. Well, how can you imprison divine law? You can't, because that's what Themis had represented. She represented divine law, divine universal law. And hell, again, she was always shown, with the blindfolds, the swords, the scales, all of those symbols, all of those were representative of truth, because the truth sees no boundaries. The truth is not blind. The truth can stretch out to any aspect of darkness. It cuts through all the bullshit of the lies, symbolic of the sword. And of course the scales hella justice, because our behaviors are supposed to be measured to a certain standard. And that's the whole point of weighing something, is you have a standard. And if it does not weigh up to this certain standard, it should not be upheld. And that was the whole point of the scales. That was the whole point of Themis. But you see, Themis represented divine order. But Themis was a bad bitch. She was a bad bitch. And when she transformed in a nemesis, oh my gosh, you're talking about divine wrath, divine universal wrath, meaning you get what you're owed, and just think about that. When you're talking about divine wrath, you get what you're owed, then you're talking about some form of cosmic debt in the form of wrong action, because you are selecting wrong action over the right action. You were choosing to ignore your conscience. You were choosing to use coercion. You were choosing to buy into fear. So these mythological stories that talked about these, feminine principles in nature were used to try to teach the initiate about how natural law and how we can alleviate suffering by way of choice. So I've already talked hell enough, and I think that was, simple, that most people can understand. And I highly encourage you, if you are not familiar with those mythological stories, to please go and check them out. So I'm going to pass it on to Derek, and thank you.
Yeah, Brandon, thanks so much for the mythological journey and gnosis of those things that we should all be considering, as far as like archetypal and conceptual ideas and forms of consciousness energy that we need to take in mind. And you mentioning natural law, and the first thing that came to mind in context to everything is just cause and effect, and what we're subjected to in this 3D reality field with all the elements going on. And we're obviously we're cut off from our higher senses, otherwise we wouldn't be fumbling around and like hurting ourselves, bruising ourselves. Like, we're talking about suffering and how much of it is really truly manufactured, and how many people are actually digging deep enough to really figure that out for themselves on an individual level and on the collective level. We're going to get into the whole governmental form of control over people and being were, all people kind of subjected to coercion, whether by police state, and going back to the Karens, where there's like these mini-me police people trying to police other people and virtue signaling like, hey, I'm following all man's laws, if you're not doing it, we're going to tell on you, or and blah fucking blah, like subjective morality and that kind of shit. But yeah, going back to being cut off to our senses and not being able to navigate this reality as smooth and slick as we would like to, like Neo in the Matrix. No one's really going through the Matrix unscathed, not even him in the awakened state. There's so many agents up in this bitch and then some, and then, just, following one's alignment towards, understanding all the hermetic principles and the rhythm of life and all these, factors that are within ourselves and without ourselves or outside ourselves. And through the collective consciousness and interacting with people, I'm going over a lot of vague things, but to narrow it down and hone it back into this whole idea of manufactured suffering, right? How much of it is that, and how much of the negative causes that we put unto ourselves is directly related to ourselves. And we really got to do some deep, serious introspection as to the law of attraction and how we've conceived from the mind our thoughts, emotions, and actions through our interactions with other people and this and that, while at the same time the overarching collective consciousness and just like people born under this form of slavery, if you like, under government, whatever country people are from, we're not all that free, if we really boil it down. So there's limitations to what we can do, our freedoms and all that, and that is just in and of itself naturally a form of suffering. So it can be frustrating, and just like little things like when we grow up, when we're little kids, we're running around, we're gonna fall down, we're gonna hurt ourselves. That's suffering, that's pain, right? But these are learning tools for us to not fucking do it again, right? In this 3D realm where it is kind of like like the cosmic kindergarten, whatever the hell you want to call it, where we're gonna it's kind of trial and error, and the least amount of errors is going to be that learning curve for people, and we can take it to the 100 monkey point, or just like learn from other people's mistakes and go through apophatic inquiries of ourselves and other people and stuff. Like I worked in so many restaurants over like a dozen years, where the most I've learned is from shitty situations where people are doing shit wrong, and I'm like, this ain't right. And so like we can do it a better way, and that's just like a compelling way of like improvement and evolution, I guess. And to avoid suffering and like frustrating moments and all that stuff, we can level the fuck up from that. And Brandon, I like how you said with the scale, it's like, where's the fucking standard? Where's that gold standard of like the golden feather of Mayat and living as light as that wonderful thing, as we did a great conversation with. So enough said on my part for the moment. I'm gonna pass it on to whoever feels good to go with it.
Rick, you want to jump in next a little bit?
I'm trying to get my thoughts together, because Brandon and makes a great point, and well, they actually, all you guys are, both of you have made a great points, and my mind's really, I'm trying to like put it in, trying to get the word thoughts in my head into words, and I'm thinking, and I think that I can just say what I'm feeling, and the question is, manufactured suffering required? Obviously, I don't think it is, but then I wonder why humanity as a whole seems to be bent on determined to learn the hard way. Because it seems as a humanity as a whole, that seems to be how we're learning, is the hard way. And I think my immediate thought is that, I'm just being honest, is why are we in that? Why is it that way? And then I think it's because the people calling the shots, you're dealing with evil, immoral people that are calling the shots, and it kind of rolls downhill. And then you have people that are willing to carry out these orders, or whatever you want to call them. You have immoral people with no principles willing to carry them out. And I just think so I wonder, like, that's where I'm going with why we're in this state of suffering, is because you have people that don't have principles or morals. And I think it's a lot of things going on. You have media that's putting out information and influencing people. So you guys, it's so complicated to me because there's so many moving parts to it. But I'm trying to get it together and where I'm thinking, but I just keep coming back to moral relativism. When you have people that, because I do believe there, and I know the universe puts laws into place, and if you follow them, you're going to get the results that you want. But people are so hell-bent on determined with this moral relativism and making the rules up as they go and thinking they can change things, that of course we're going to get that's what we're going to get back. We're going to get back what we're getting, because you have people that are, they have no principles or morals. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. As I was just saying, it kind of rolls downhill. You have people willing to carry out orders that are immoral. You have the influence of social media feeding people 24/7, and people not knowing about natural law. And I think that's so important. I hope I make sense. I'm kind of all over the place. I do apologize, but that's where my mind goes, is when I just think, why is humanity where it is? And it's because, we're of moral relativism. That's what I think. And I think we're people that try to change the rules and make them up as they go along and think they can rewrite them and deviate around them and stuff like that. That's why we're getting all of this suffering. It's just because we're not living with the rules that the universe put in place, the laws that they're in place for a reason, to keep us on that road. And the reason that we're not is because we're being influenced in so many different ways. And then people have they don't realize they have no morality. A lot of people don't have principles. They don't even have a foundation to build on. And so when you have everything coming at you like that, as I was saying earlier, it's going to steer people to where we are. So that's my thoughts. I hope that makes sense. Maybe you guys can
Yeah.
kind of make sense out of
And
it. But I think
yeah, great points. Great points. But real quick too, I just want to note that suffering is not only cause, it also means to prevent from happening. So we have people who are also causing suffering, but then we also have a lot of people who just turn a blind eye to it, which continues it.
that's true.
So yeah, I just wanted to make that clear.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, I feel you, Rick. I struggled a lot thinking about this too. But yeah, when it comes to manufactured suffering, it makes me think of it like the highest form of that is the mind control that people are under. Like that's manufactured, right? That's basically what you've been saying. The government, the mind control, that's manufactured suffering. And another big word that sticks out for me is responsibility. And we're not taking responsibility because we do know that so many people are suffering. And I thought of, like you've been hearing a lot lately about the cell phones in Congo and that, and we all have these things and we use them, and we know like that's manufactured suffering, all that mining of the cobalt and that, and I'm not taking responsibility for that, but that's really a modern day form of slavery. Um, as of course we know there's so many others, but like that's more like in the physical realm. But yeah, that's just that's what I got is like kind of there with Rick, like that. If anybody wants to jump off of that, like the manufactured suffering really is the mind control that we're under, people are under.
Yeah, and it's a thick all around us. I feel like one of my personal struggles has been, like, since I was little, I felt like something that Mark Passio talked about that really hit me was the way he described how things get manifested into reality, and the way I've kind of run it around in my head is that first it starts with just a thought, you know, and a thought can kind of like build into an idea. You know, the thought might just be, I wonder if I could do something. And then the idea will be like, oh, here's what something might look like. And then that idea becomes reality when we do it in the real world. But what that aspect shows, that it seems like kind of far away from what we're talking about, but it shows that there's more to this reality than just the physical world. And I think the argument has been from a lot of people when we start talking about the soul. You know, is the soul a real thing? You know, we got different philosophies. What Brandon was sharing with us a very interesting philosophy of the Egyptians, and that's something I was looking into a little myself, and I found very interesting. But you know, it also, let's compare a little bit. We got like the Buddhists with the idea of the eternal soul, and you got Hindus with the idea that being born again multiple times, right? You got resurrection idea, you know, with the Christianity of being born again and waking up to this reality. And then, you know, we got like nirvana, heaven, these different ideas, right? The trouble I have with all these different religions and stories is that there's an aspect of it that's asking you to believe, right? But what we don't have to believe is suffering. It's something we can experience. It's very real in this world. We all experience it, right? And more times than not, isn't it? I'm going to ask you, isn't suffering a result of things we do? And that's manufactured suffering, as Brandon has put it so well. Obviously, childbirth, there's a certain amount of suffering, but even so, why are we having a child? Because we decided to, a man and woman decided to get together and get it on, right? Like they knew that that might lead to a child and they chose to do it. Everything in our life where we make choices, there's always the possibility of suffering on the other side of those choices. And so the bigger question is, how does that matter in the big scheme of things? How does it affect our soul? Do we have a soul? What happens after we die? And that's where I think the Egyptian mythology that Brandon brings up is kind of unique compared to a lot of them, because the Egyptian mythology puts the responsibility on the individual, that you're the one that's going to have to face this feather when you die. And if you know, if you don't weigh up correctly on those scales, you're going to go to Amit, the devourer, you know. And I did some work on Amit on some, you know, their idea was you just straight up get eaten. You know, the monster of the universe is going to chomp you in the stomach and you're going to get smashed into universal bits, you know, and that probably ain't going to feel too good. So, you know, it's a concept and it's idea, but it's very much based on the individual. So I think that's an important concept, but it's also important to recognize these are stories and myths, and what's the purpose behind them is to make us aware of something that can't quite be only figured out with the logical left brain mind. It requires a certain level of intuition, seeing the bigger picture, the connection on the soul level, on the small, minute in my personal life, and then how that affects everybody and what might happen after we die. So I'm going to kick it over to Jerry. He's been really quiet. I know he's got a lot of good ideas. I hope I spurred something for you to jump off from. You're up next, Jerry.
Thanks, Chris. Great points. What's it called? It feels nice that you say that I have something good to say. So I actually had a question to for Brandon. Because I wanted to just ask if you could touch on the divine law, that the Titan that didn't go to prison. If you could just touch on that once again, please.
Yes, Themis. She was a symbolic representation, and they called it divine law. And I understand why they would use that word, because you know, like when you like how we say the term how natural law, you know, so we just equate it like with the earth. But when you say how divine, you're talking about something that's like out of this world, you know, like kind of like cosmos, like godly, you know, in and of a sense. But she was just held the principle. So held the Greeks had this concept because they had, of course, many forms of law, but they equated divine law to be the highest, because they obviously understood the importance of consequence. Now, hell, mind you, we all know that the Greek civilization eventually turned into how the Roman civilization. So, you know, how obviously it was some form of contradictory there. But at least this principle, this aspect was there to teach them, like, hey, it's not just about you. There's something bigger to this whole thing that we call life. There's something bigger to this whole thing that we call, earth. Getting people to see a bigger picture. So when you use the word divine, you're thinking godly. You're thinking out of this world, not human. So this concept, this immutable principle was used as a teaching grounds because, hell, again, they didn't just teach it in the aspect of the caring. To teach just one side of it is incorrect because you only get 50% of the knowledge. They also taught that this divine law didn't give a shit about her belief. It didn't give a shit, hell, about her intentions. It was just that it rewarded us what we put out into it, which is why you had two concepts, themis and nemesis. And nemesis was actually there to invoke a natural form of fear to get people to choose, to make the right choice. Because if you look into what nemesis had represented, it would be like, how ancient man always said, well, how the gods punished us, how the gods sent the flood, how the gods, how did this. Well, that's what they was meaning by divine law. Is Themis is going to transform into hell nemesis, and she's going to teach us a lesson. And here's the thing: it's no different than when you have to discipline a child. You don't really want to have to do it, but you do it in order for them to learn. It was a learning aspect which has to be understood. Themis, hell nemesis, does not care. She's only here to guide and to teach us to learn and grow. That's what these concepts and symbolic principles were there for, is to teach us, to teach us. And hell, again, when it comes to learning, do we have to touch a hot stove in order to know that it's going to burn us? Do we have to? No, thank you. We don't. And I'm going to explain this because I use the same concept, because by touching that hot stove, you are going to symbolically meet Ishvet, because it's going to be chaos. How your hand is going to be blistering. You're going to be suffering. But because of your ignorance, you chose to ignore the somatic sensory cortex, which is in the parietal, how right here, of course, you have the occipital lobe, you have the frontal lobe, and you have the temporal lobes. Well, the somatic sensory cortex is the region in, is the region in our neocortex which responds to temperature, heat, pressure, and it sends off certain signals. Because he'll just think, as you get closer to a fire or to a stove, what happens? We use our extremities to perceive information. So even if you are blind and you can see that fire, you can put your hand closer to that stove, and the sensors in your fingertips, because we have sensors in our fingertips, we also have hairs. That's the whole point of why our bodies are constructed the way that they are. As you get close to, how that heat, that pressure, that temperature, those sensors in your fingers are going to react. They're going to respond. And what are they going to do? They're going to relay that information up through your central nervous system, all the way up into the thalamus, all the way up into the brain. And it's going to go into that sensory cortex, that somatic sensory cortex, which the word somatic just means, relating to the body, not relating to the mind or brain. So it's a sensory, part of the brain that takes in information from what we sense. It's the opposite of the primary motor cortex, which takes in, like information as far as, like how what we do with the hands, like how input. So it's kind of like a left brain way of taking in information, and the sensory somatic cortex is like the right brain way of taking in senses. But they both take in information. So as we get close to that fire, something in our brain is going to be telling us, like, hey, don't do it. Hey, there's heat. Hey, there's pressure. So we can learn from that. Also, too, we can learn from other people's experiences. Do we have to keep jumping off a cliff to understand gravity? No, we don't. We can learn from the experiences and experiment, throw things off a cliff, and we're going to get that immutable result every time, you know? So I use that concept of touching the hot stove because you can use that same concept to get people to understand, like, hey, do we really have to suffer in order to learn? No. There are many ways that we can learn, a lot of ways that we can learn. Yes, we can learn from suffering. I'm not denying that. But it's a route that once you start to go down and you don't fix it, you're immutably going to lead toward nemesis. Unfortunately, because that's just the way that the laws are. And again, like I said earlier, there is responsibility that comes with being. And there is responsibility that comes with being at our level of consciousness, even though it is extremely low. There's still consequences that are going to come for that no one will ever be able to escape. And sadly, we are, receiving those consequences because people don't want to, reach and grasp that responsibility just for being. There are responsibilities that come with just being humans. So I hope that kind of, like touches more up on the whole Themis and Nemesis, her aspect, because hell again, Themis was one of the gods who's not really talked about. She was actually higher than Zeus. I mean, Jesus. But yeah, she was one of the higher gods who kind of gets left out in history. But she represented an immutable divine principle, which was talked about in a lot of ancient civilizations.
That
Yeah,
answer.
thank you.
Go ahead, Derek. You're up.
Ooh, thank you. So yeah, like what you just touched upon, a minute ago, Brandon, thank you for everything on that. As far as like taking responsibility for your actions, that puts so much more power and, control behind the driver's seat of your life. As someone who's learned the hard way, pretty much, pretty hardcore almost every year of my life, having my Saturn on the 29th degree on some, hardcore learning shit. And yes, pain has been a hell of a fucking lesson for me and like so many other people out there as well. And yeah, the quicker we, own up to our shit, realize uh, our faults or our, errors in our ways and correct those, the less pain we're going to have. And I think, what are we doing exactly? And like, what is part of why we even come on to the camera and speak about any of this stuff is because we don't want to have future generations, continue the same negative cycles of this self-inflicted fucking suffering, whether on the individual collective level, right? So that's part of, what this is about. And we have to take it back to the question of, the title of the video of, well, who is manufacturing the suffering? It's a multi-layered question. And, what kind of suffering are we talking about? It's all, everyone has their own suffering and we all have to own up to our own shit. And that's part of the healing on the individual level that, gets amplified into the collective. And, it's part of that awakening process, the 100 monkey thing or whatever the hell, right? So there's that aspect to consider as far as any kind of words of encouragement. Yeah, that's all I got to say on that. But yeah, who's good? Yeah, Chris was good, man. I like your crow in the background. Is that a raven?
Yeah,
Or,
yeah. It says on it a conspiracy of one.
yeah,
A conspiracy. Interesting.
because you're always breathing in on the universe. The universe is going to be, speaking with you whether you wanted to or not.
Aspire. Yeah, conspire. Jerry, did you get your question answered? Do you have anything else you wanted to add to that?
Well, I think what he said was on point, and I don't have anything else to add. I'll wait after these gentlemen go.
Well, I had a kind of interesting, what would you call it? Like a coincidence. I guess there is no such thing of coincidences, but it was a serendipitous thing. Just recently, I was out on the lake. I like to spend time on the lake, and I had a little raft, and I wound up standing on it like I would my paddleboard, and I was paddling, and I was thinking about, the Egyptian, because Brandon had been talking about the Egyptian mythology, and I was thinking about who's the guy who ferries him across the river, and I looked it up, and it's Sharon. And I thought that was kind of funny because we were talking about Karen last week in our last conversation, and here Sharon was the demon spirit that took you across the water. But the thought I had when I was on the lake, and I was thinking about what I was thinking about is how do we our balance in life, right? As I was balancing on this boat, I'm using my left and right leg, and I thought about in a way like you kind of make this triangle shape when you're standing in a balanced shape, right? Your head's at the top, and your two legs, they're like, our brain is balanced, right? Our right and left hemisphere. Or you could think of the two principles, right? The self-defense principle and the non-aggression principle. There's this the female and the male. There's all these elements in every aspect of life, right? But then up top we have our head, that thinks, and it drives the boat, right? But in that balance, it's similar to the scales we're talking about, right? There is a balance on how we lead our life. And when we get out of balance, the further you go one way, like whether it's a water, right? You lean one way, you got to compensate the other way or you're going to fall in, right? When you're driving, if you start getting out of control and you swerve one way, you got to swerve back. And the crazier your swerving gets, the more difficult it is to get under control. So that's the suffering, right? When you crash, when you fall into the fire, right? And it's because you got too out of control. You didn't keep the balance. And so I think really life, suffering helps us learn balance, because like you ignore your hand feeling the heat, boom, you feel the burn. And then you got to suffer for a few days or a few weeks until you learn, don't put your hand there, right? And the same with the balance. We're constantly, everything we're doing in life is providing this back and forth action for everything we do. We're feeling the reaction. And I don't know how we could deny that as being a reality, because to me, that is the reality we live on. It's like giving us constant stimulus through our emotions on how we're doing or how things are going. So how do we take these thoughts and transmute them into something we could do positive in our life, or figure out how we could speak to others about some of these more difficult concepts? Anybody want to take this for any advice or comments for listeners, and how we can put all this together into something that people can take away? Pretty complicated question. Takeaways. What comes to mind, guys?
Well, I had one more aspect as far as how we understand the suffering is real that I wanted to touch on. But if anyone wanted to answer that question real quick, feel free, because I've talked hell enough.
Yeah, go ahead, Brandon. Oh, but if I said that wrong, the ferryman was Karen. That was the actual name. It's spelled like Sharon, Charon, but it's said Karen, which is really funny.
Yeah.
Because he's like kind of literally, this character is like the least caring guy of all. You guys give a shit about it. Give me your coin or you don't cross my river. Just pure balance, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Chris, does it help to answer your question? I mean, so yeah, you've probably heard in the New Age realm, or even the conspiratorial or whatever, or like this notion that even at the cosmic highest level, that there needs to be bad in order for people to understand that there's good.
Yeah.
And so if that's the case, then there's like ultimate suffering for everyone kind of thing. And it's like, did the creator intend that just, because it's like this false sense of duality that's not in alignment to the true cosmic principle of polarity, which I wanted to touch on, even Brandon, before you mentioned the whole stove thing, because that's, you know, part of understanding natural law and just like being in touch with your senses and the elements of understanding the difference between hot and cold. And yeah, like there's going to be a little delay time before you get to that super hotness from where you're standing or where your arm is. And yeah, these hands, man, they're fucking magic, man. Brandon put together a great presentation on that. That's all I wanted to say. Anything you got, JJ? Jim Jerry?
I just had a question for Brandon as far as in the modern day, is there any like modern day characters to look people can look at like to compare to Demis and Nemesis, or you know what I mean? Like what that's all like
Yeah,
disappeared now. Like how
yeah.
come that's not around anymore, you
Well,
know?
yeah, okay.
Or
We're
is it,
all
you know?
okay, yeah. I'm going to use this hell analogy. And Jerry, don't take this the wrong way, but Jerry may be the youngest one. He may not he'll remember this. But you remember in the 90s in a TV show or something like that, when you had the main character was faced with a choice, you would see the devil pop up on one shoulder and the devil would be whispering in their ear, or it would be like a angel. I'm sorry, I guess like a dark spirit, like in red, and it will be whispering, you know, like in their ear, yeah, you know, go screw this person over, you know, he'll go and do this, go out and drink, you know, go out and party, you know, hell, what do you care hell about the consequences? Then it would hell disappear. Then on the completely opposite shoulder, you would see a kind of divine-like creature pop up and say, hey, you know, think about how the choices, you know, what would be the right thing to do. We saw that a lot growing up in the late 80s and early 90s. And the reason why I think we don't have these characters or these symbolic representations is because once the advancement of technology came, they knew that they could stir people's consciousness in such a degree and decrease it to where those kind of symbolic representations inevitably died off because like Mark Passio said, you know, the psychopaths have given us their minds at a smaller level, you know, so they wouldn't want these symbolic representations being thrown on any kind of, you know, her television show or in any movie, you know, these days. So that's what I would equate it to, you know, like the whole person popping on the shoulder. And then because I saw that a lot growing up in certain TV shows, in certain movies.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure how y'all remember that too, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then how nowadays, like past 2000, it kind of died off because you see what the consciousness has inevitably been. Because ever since, you know, 2001, the consciousness started to what? Decrease exponentially. And it's all by design. It's not by chance, you know. So it's it kind of gets into like the whole mind control aspect because, you know, once the technology started to come, you know, once the technology got to a certain point and our consciousness got below, you know, where the technology was, then it was pretty much like going to lead toward failure. So that's what I would use as a more like newer form of allegory because there aren't really a lot of, I guess you can say, modern mythological stories or ones that I know of. And even if they are, there really aren't any different than the old ones because they all they all contain certain things. You know, they all contain certain symbols and archetypes to get you to understand the richness, you know, how the fullness, the meaning, and the clarity, not within the story, but in here and in here.
You know, Brandon, you reminded me. I had to go to Disneyland one time. This was quite a few years ago. I didn't have to go. I decided to go along. His family was going, and I remember um, being in there on the ride for Pinocchio. And they in that ride they actually was pretty neat painting on the wall. And that story of Pinocchio is where Jiminy Cricket popped up. And I've talked about him in some of my presentations. Jiminy Cricket represented our conscience, right? Like you
Yes.
were saying, the angel and the devil. And in that story, all the young people were tempted to go to this island where you could smoke cigars and play games. And there were no consequences, is the way that these con men basically sold this idea. And I think that's a good allegorical story to show the situation we're in this world, where things are really back-assward. You have to go against the flow when the flow is people all doing evil things. And for those out there who think that the world is not full of suffering, I would ask you to really spend some time looking into statistics on the number of people that go missing every year. Look on the statistics of child trafficking, and you begin to understand even human trafficking, child sex trafficking, that the numbers are probably worse than they've ever been in history, because it's hidden behind this facade of modern day technology and modern day, oh, we're living in a much more organized society than we ever have in history, and now we have this freedom, so-called, right? But behind the scenes, there's more homeless than we ever seen before. So if these structures we have in place are not evil, then why aren't they doing anything about this? If these wealthy people that are in power, that have money right now, that own the world, why aren't they doing anything about human trafficking on a mass scale, and child sex trafficking, and homelessness, and all these super big problems, where there's plenty of money out there to take care of these problems if money was the solution, but it's not being put there, which to me just shows how bad we're suffering, that we can't even recognize the obvious dynamic that's going on around us, and we're so easily fooled into submitting and just kind of like looking the other way while all the suffering is going on right around us. So to me, that's the most obvious way to see that what we're experiencing is chaos and mayhem, not what people call chaos and anarchy. Is not that word does not mean chaos and mayhem, but that's what people think it means, because they've been programmed through the media. And that's part of what keeps leading us into suffering, thinking things are the opposite of what they are. It's good to have a super organized technological society that just tells us what to do and makes rules on books and paper that we can follow. Laws are good. That's the way people think. They keep us safe. And that's why we're suffering, because we continue believing that obvious lie. That's kind of how I'd conclude, but I'll pass it on. Anybody else want to throw some conclusion action in? I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, one more thing, because you brought up that Pinocchio scene, and I'm glad you did, because I remember that scene very well. And I remember Jordan Peterson, the older Jordan Peterson, like 12 years ago, he actually broke the Pinocchio scene down, and he talked about that, because I remember all the kids who went to the island, what happened to them? They end up turning into animals.
They turn into jackasses.
Yes, yes. So it was a symbolic representation of what happens when we follow the illusion, when we follow the mind control, when we follow. Yep. And it's no difference, than what the church has done, but that's a whole different story. But to get in my last aspect of how can we come to know, how natural law, like is manufactured suffering required. So when we look at the principle of vibration, we know that nothing is truly ever still, nothing ever truly rest, like is at rest. So you can equate that to where you're all forms of energy, like everything is made up of energy. So what is the energetic vibration? What is the energetic frequency that you feel when someone has stolen from you? What is the energetic frequency when someone has been raped? What is the energetic frequency when someone has been murdered? Like, what is the feeling that you feel internally? Have you ever come across one person who has experienced transgression against natural law that has said that they have felt good? Not one, because you're not going to, because there is an energetic frequency that comes with wrong action, just as though there is an energetic frequency with right action. You see, when you do something that is truly right, that is truly good for someone else, it's uplifting. It makes them feel good. They'll respond in a certain way. Even the people who are in that environment will respond, because that's what love does. It's a frequency. So you look at it from an energetic frequency, and we all know that, like our bodies have a morphogenic, have energy field because all things do. So that field starts to radiate that positive energy. Well, you know how the same thing happens on the negative, you know, when there is violence. What is the energetic frequency that's put out? Fear. And you can feel fear, not just within yourself, but you can feel the state when someone else is in fear. It is literally a feeling that you fear. And I know we have all felt it. So there are multiple ways for one to show you how the manufactured suffering is not required, because what is the energetic frequencies and what is the consequences on the body? The stress, the fear, the anxiety. What does that all equate to? Bad health, bad way of living, low loss of living, because the body is not meant to be in high states of fear, anxiety, and stress all the time, because that is an energetic frequency that causes what? Chaos. And what happens when man is in internal chaos? What happens when our bodies are in chaos? What happens when our organs are in chaos? What happens when our cells are in chaos? It starts to break down, starts to fight against each other. So hell, so hell again, I came like with three different angles, you know, which I think all are extremely plausible for anyone to understand, you know. So just some food for thought. Just some food for thought.
Who's hungry?
I'll just, I'll just say that manufactured suffering is required for government to succeed, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Good
that's
point.
what they know. That's the realization of them, and then the rest of the people have to understand that too. That's how they're getting over on us. But thank you, and just to close, I just think this human experience is so amazing, and I know we all did come here, our souls came here to experience as part of the human uh life suffering, but that's a whole like other subject of what are our soul. But I believe that. But anyway, I'll pass it to Rick.
Oh, you guys all make great points. Wow. I've just been really enjoying the conversation and listening. And I just trying to break it down. I always try to break things down to the simplest so I can just give people like a sound bite or something that they can think about. And I just like to tell people, and it seems to work for me, is that you get what you put out. That's really that's how I look at it. You know, the energy that you're putting out is what it's gonna echo back, and that's what you're gonna receive. So, you know, if you're putting out positive energy and um you have principles and you have morals and you know what real rights are, you're going to be putting out that positive energy and it's going to come back. If you're somebody that's putting out negative energy and hurting people and lying to people, stealing from people, that's what's going to come back. And so the more that people start getting in alignment with natural law and start getting principles as a foundation and build upon that, the more people that start learning this and understanding it and putting it out is how we're going to change things in the aggregate. How that's going to change, worldwide. It starts with us, with each person. And that's what we have to work on. It always seems to come back to that. Every conversation I have these days seems to come back that's the work that's required, is that people don't want to do, is they have to start looking at themselves and asking the hard questions and dealing with them and getting right with themselves and taking in this information. And then once they do, they're naturally going to, I would hope, put the good, energy forward. And I think that's how you're going to change things. So that's what I would leave with people. Just be really conscious of what you're putting out is what's going to come back.
Yeah, Jerry, I know you want to say something to close out. I just want to tag on with what Rick was saying and ask another question, because we've all suffered to whatever degree, to whatever level, and there's trauma, there's intergenerational trauma, or past life trauma, all these things to consider. What are we doing to try to heal that, break those cycles, reinvent the wheel towards the more positive polarity of things? Get that shit spinning, yo. I see you grinning, yo.
Well, I got lots of ideas myself, and I think that having that imagination running is the key, for people to actually try to think about it. And that's a huge step because a lot of us haven't been ever encouraged or trained to do this type of thinking. So it's a long road for humans right now because humans have been stunted in their growth in so many ways. Jerry, you got any concluding thoughts you want to share with us, buddy?
Yeah, what Derek said, the question, the question is, how can we switch from one polarity to the other or the next? I think discipline, um, habits, so starting, being consistent at changing, and then that becomes a habit, and then it's second nature. So I certainly feel that suffering is not required to it's not necessary, and yeah, I was watching a video about manufactured suffering, but this was um referring to how we are addicted to suffering because like our ancestors went through a lot of suffering for us to be where we are, and so that's like the I don't know, nature, but we can like nurture, right? You have that the nurture. So I just advise to nurture yourself. That's it. I'll leave it at that.
Awesome. Well, anybody else got any closing remarks before I kind of finish this up?
Yeah, my thing I want people to understand is manufactured suffering is what causes trauma. Manufactured suffering is what causes trauma. And trauma just means to a split, a wound. So as long as we stay divided, we will continue to create manufactured suffering because we will continue to stay traumatized and we will continue to traumatize others.
Great point.
Right on. Well, I'll just kind of close it out by saying this. You know, like Rick was saying, it's really important what we put out there, and that's our intentions, our expectations, and those are all based on how we think. And if we're stuck on beliefs, that's going to affect how we think. So, what we put out into the world is important, and it's not like a cartoon. We're not every time you do something bad, an anvil's not going to fall on your head. Sometimes it's hard to see why some people are getting away with the evil they are in the world. Why are these psychopaths still ruling over us? And I think that's where it really comes down to asking ourselves, are we doing enough to stop them? People have been planning for many years to figure out ways to get one over on other humans. And those of us that are planning and working towards a better future, we need to be working harder than they are. And that means putting effort and taking responsibility for our choices and questioning and thinking about things that have been passed down from previous generations. Just because they suffered doesn't mean we need to create that same suffering for our grandchildren and their grandchildren. We can rethink it. So that's what I would leave you with. Use your imagination. Consider a better way, folks. We got to stop the mass stealing. So that's another awesome discussion. One great work, warriors. Thanks so much, guys, for joining me today. Anybody want to shout out your show or something you're working on? Feel free. You can check me out at andevil.life and freedomundernaturallaw.com.
Yeah, and we're trying to dissolve some divides with Leslie Powers, and Brandon's been on, and a bunch of other wonderful folks. And yeah, we're just trying to encourage ways where we can end slavery and suffering, you know, be alive and thriving, if you will. And if you're awake at the lake in Reading somewhere too, that's cool. But keep it light as a feather, God damn it, or God love it, rather. Not trying to put anything above it, but hey, you know, like taking it back to the hardcore intelligence, and you know, taking it back to Mayat and Ishvet, and finding that balance within yourself amidst everything going on. You know, like no one's got it super fucking easy. Even like this golden spoon-fed babies out there, whatever the fuck, you know, like we're all subjected to a lot of bullshit out here. So, you know, like
That's
we could
true.
all try to help each other out, each one teach one, and, you know, reach up to the next level of, you know, standards of living where there's less suffering for everyone, kind of thing. But yeah, peace out, everyone.
Right on. All right. Check out Crypt Rick's I've Been Thinking. Check out Jim's Truth in Your Heart YouTube channel. Check out Brandon Spencer, Odyssey, and on the One Great Work Network. And Jerry, you also have your YouTube channel pumping, and Instagram, something like that, right? All right. Much love, guys. We'll see you next time. Peace Warriors out.
Yes.